Hey everyone, back again with another video. So, I just recently watched a very interesting podcast between the professor from Tolarian Community College, he does a lot of Magic the Gathering stuff, and Paul from Team APS, where they discussed the differences and similarities between Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh!, which I found to be very constructive. And they covered everything from the power creep to how expensive each respective card game is. But I wanted to focus on the last point they made, which they talk about people leaving Yu-Gi-Oh! For MTG, or Magic the Gathering. So the professor from Tolarian Community College mentioned about half of his audience have played Yu-Gi-Oh! And they left for Magic. And he was interested to know why people kind of left Yu-Gi-Oh! And if there's the same effect happening from the other side, from Magic leaving onto Yu-Gi-Oh! And he was kind of interested in seeing if that actually happened. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. And as always, please check out the video in the description below. I normally post the video in question there that I'm talking about. And check it out, because I feel like this is a very important topic and it can be very constructive. So I think there can be two main reasons why, to sum up, why people really leave Yu-Gi-Oh! For Magic. And you're gonna kind of see these 2 points I bring up, they're kind of interwoven with a lot of other sub-issues or subtopics and problems that other people may have. And this is by no means a comprehensive list, but I do think these two issues are the main things why people often quit Yu-Gi-Oh! And go for other card games like Magic, or they just quit completely. So the first one being power creep, and the next one being the introduction of new extra deck mechanics. Keep in mind that there is no hard statistic that shows why people leave Yu-Gi-Oh! For Magic, or just leave Yu-Gi-Oh! In general. So I'm going to have to rely on analyzing personal examples along with anecdotal evidence that I've seen from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community as well, along with my personal experience in general. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, please note that this isn't meant to be the end-all be-all in terms of this discussion. It's not meant to say this is the definitive reason. I'm just giving you the thoughts I think may explain why I feel a lot of people often quit Yu-Gi-Oh! So without any further ado, let's get into it. So, if you don't know what power creep is the increased strength that new cards typically have over older cards, like Dark World versus Adamantimators. So, newer cards typically replace older cards because of it. This doesn't always happen, but it's usually the case. And power creep can affect decks or individual cards, like Heavy Storm versus Lightning Storm. However, power creep is inevitable, and it is pretty much in every card game. Though many players say it's much more pronounced and evident in Yu-Gi-Oh! For the most part. And it's been one of the biggest criticisms in Yu-Gi-Oh! To be honest, and I believe it's one of the main reasons why players quit Yu-Gi-Oh! And the reason why I say that power creep tends to be one of the reasons why Yu-Gi-Oh! Players quit is because Yu-Gi-Oh! Has historically been a very expensive game, and the impression is that the power creep makes it so that you usually have to play the most recent deck, and it's usually the most expensive deck, in order to compete in the game. So even if you play casually, if you don't use a relevant enough deck, you're bound to come across a player who is using a very competitive deck and will absolutely annihilate your deck. It's like using Elemental Heroes versus Adamantimators, or even a modern day build of Heroes versus Adamantimators. The power ceiling between those two decks is just too different. Heroes just will have a rough time against Adamantimators. So this player will quickly figure out that their favorite deck can't effectively compete with this new, stronger deck, and it may be very discouraging for this player as a result. And they might find themselves at a crossroads. So they may ask themselves, should they reinvest the money into a new competitive deck, or should they just save themselves the time and money and quit the game? And Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are more frequently faced with this crossroads as power creep increases, especially since power creep is higher in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's at a faster pace in Yu-Gi-Oh! And more players are likely to quit because the power creep is way too fast. and they simply can't or want to reinvest into this new deck that they're going to have to build. And power creep usually increases when new sets are released, where new, more popular and more powerful archetypes are also released as well. An example of this would be Gokis. Gokis were one of the most dominant decks 2 years back, and now you barely hear about them. They've nearly completely fallen off the face of the earth, quite frankly. And the last time you really see them have some success in the meta was at Pro Play Tour in 2020 of January, earlier on in this year, and their presence was pretty much almost non-existent. And the appearance of a new powerful deck named Eldritch came into the mix in the meta a few months after, and you really don't see Gokis anymore, since Eldritches are another deck that Gokis just can't compete against anymore, and especially since they had such a hard time against other decks to begin with that were already dominant in the meta. But just to give more of a specific example of the power creep in the Yu-Gi-Oh community is more of a first-hand experience that Trell from Team APS had, that he basically explained in one of the videos they made. So he explained the situation where a player attended his locals with a Dino Rabbit deck. This is back in the day, and that Dino Rabbit deck pretty much outcompeted every other deck in his locals, basically because that deck has a wholly different power ceiling than most of the other decks at the locals at the time. And the situation basically puts into perspective just how big of a difference power creep makes between decks. I'm sure there were some rogue decks there, and I'm sure there were some more current decks there, and the fact that none of those decks even came close, that this Dino Rabbit deck pretty much consistently beat all those other decks, points out a huge problem between the power creep decks that are more meta-centric and basically them outcompeting all the other decks. So that's mainly the disparity that I'm trying to drive home here. But one of the more, I guess, extreme examples of power creep took the form as Dragon Rulers. So Dragon Rulers quite literally warped the format back in the day, since they were so capable of searching their deck and summoning other Dragon Rulers so easily, which often led to many first turn KOs. On top of easy summons, Dragon Rulers easily rebuild their board upon destruction, and they could still easily recover their cards if banished. I experienced this firsthand, and I kept board wiping my opponent when I was dueling this person with a Dragon Ruler deck, and he instantly, and pretty much when it came to his turn, he recuperated all of the resources, all the monsters, all the cards he lost in the turn I board wiped him, and he eventually out-resourced my deck. And so basically, the main issue is this deck had just a power ceiling and just an advantage that the other decks simply didn't have. This deck could just unfairly reoccur all the resources they lost, and they could just outgrind the opponent, in which case I found myself in that situation too. So that's basically the gist of I guess one of the most meta warping decks back in those days. That's really one of, I guess you can consider Dragon Rulers one of the most terrifying examples that the power creep can pretty much produce as a result. Another source of power creep has to do with the ban list, and this is what I call ban list power creep. So the ban list does impact which decks remain powerful and which decks fall out of favor. And a more modern day example of this is Thunder Dragons. So if you didn't know, Thunder Dragons were incredibly competitive in the meta for a while, and after Thunder Dragon Colossus being banned, they haven't had much success after. And if players still try using Thunder Dragons, they typically find out that they have a very difficult match against most of the other meta decks. I personally was one of the people who felt the hit to Thunder Dragons, since I was playing them in late 2019 and I was playing them in early 2020. And I've grown a bit resilient to having a deck of mine getting keycards banned, since I felt the brunt of it in earlier years. And to think about it, that's kind of messed up, because instantly when I saw this deck get hit, I thought, oh, this isn't as bad. It used to be worse in years prior to this. So, but that still points out a very big issue. Although it is a lot better now, it still points out that this happens, and that's a problem, in my opinion, I guess. But although I'm pretty resilient to this phenomena. I can really see newer players, or just players that play Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, become a lot more jaded, especially if they really invest into a deck and they really enjoyed that deck. I can see them becoming frustrated and wind up quitting Yu-Gi-Oh! Since this deck just got annihilated and they invested so much money into building this deck that they can't use anymore, pretty much. So, to draw upon another personal experience, I had a friend of mine that played Blue Eyes a few years back when it became somewhat viable with Alternate Dragon after that released, and Pot of Desires. And the issue was that Blue Eyes had legitimate flaws, but it also made it easier because of those flaws for other decks to outcompete it. But it also suffered due to a ban list power creep, due to the ban of Dark Matter Dragon, which really discouraged this friend of mine, because Dark Matter Dragon really gave Blue Eyes more of a competitive edge in the meta, and this ban further made it so that other decks could outcompete it. And this really discouraged my friend because he had placed a lot of money. You guys know if you built a Blue Eyes deck that it's not cheap to build this deck, especially that he just saw it become relevant in the meta. He was discouraged by this favorite deck of his getting stomped, essentially. So players invest a lot of money into these cards, much like I did with Thunder Dragons, and the high cost adds to a sting/bad taste that is left in players' mouths after having these very expensive decks get banned. So the process of banning decks and introducing more powerful cards/decks in place of these older ones used to be more prevalent years ago, and it still happens today. And the fact that it still happens may be responsible for player attrition from Yu-Gi-Oh! Today, and I feel like it is one of the main issues why a lot of people attritioned from Yu-Gi-Oh! Years back. So now we get into the second reason why I feel a lot of people tend to quit Yu-Gi-Oh! So I've consistently heard that the introduction of new extra deck mechanics has made people want to quit, including the people around them. So, new extra deck cards may rub people the wrong way in the sense that people don't want to play the game anymore since it's so different. I know that seems a little bit shallow, but we'll get into the details of it. While Synchros and XYZs might have caused some people to quit, I've noticed a higher attrition when Pendulum Monsters were introduced. And I've heard the same thing for Links, but if there was any extra deck mechanic that I've heard, Pendulum Monsters had to have been the most complained about. So to draw upon more of my experiences, most of the people I knew who were playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Started to quit when Pendulums hit. So they expressed that they felt Pendulums were too broken and allowed for too many spam combos to exist. So this is more evident especially when Pepe format came around and an emergency ban list was issued because of their broken mechanic, especially Draco Pepe or Performa Pals, which Pepe is a short acronym for that. But that's basically the gist of it. And to draw upon a more specific example, I had the chance to speak with someone at Locals about his experience with Yu-Gi-Oh! The conversation began after I started to play Magic the Gathering with another friend, and we were playing Magic with other groups of players who played Magic at that same location. And I had two friends with me that day. So one of the Magic players we were playing against noticed that one of my friends was playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And he told the same friend that was playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Right next to me. The Magic player said, "I remember playing Yu-Gi-Oh!" And he sounded jaded when he said that. So it wasn't quite like how I said it, but he did sound jaded. Which prompted my friend to ask him, well, why did you quit Yu-Gi-Oh? He stopped and he basically said he quit playing around when Pendulums hit because their spamming reminded him of quote-unquote this stupid dragon deck that he played, as he put it. Basically he was saying it was broken. And I eventually found out that he was referring to Dragon Rulers, and he felt that the game was going out of control since the new decks were outpacing pretty much some of the other current decks and even somewhat current decks of the time. He continued saying that he felt there was almost no balance and Pendulums kind of worsened the game, and he was glad that he left Yu-Gi-Oh! For Magic, since he felt Magic balanced things a little more. And I could notice just how frustrated he was just by telling his story. I mean, he really looked and sounded bitter because of it, and I couldn't help but just sympathize with the poor guy, because he really did look like he had been through a lot. And I mean, I can't blame him. He had been through dragon rulers, and not many people are fond of dragon rulers. So that was one example. And another instance of this was when I was at a gathering and I had met someone who had played Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic. So he had played competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Before he went to Magic, and he said he mainly got out of Yu-Gi-Oh! Back when pendulums hit. He expressed a similar story to the person I had talked to at Locals, and he said he felt like it was going to enable too many spam strategies, and he felt that the pendulum mechanics seemed very convoluted in general. Which, to his credit, the pendulum summon rules did change along with the pendulum zones shortly after, which may have added a little more to the confusion for new and returning players to Yu-Gi-Oh! Even players who had just been playing for a while now. I mean, it may not have been as rough of a transition, but it still is confusing to have the rules just changed up on you all of a sudden for a very small reason, I guess. But that pretty much has been my main case in point, and kind of like all the instances that I thought were pretty much relevant to this topic. And I really did want to make this video because it does open up a very important discussion that the professor pretty much left at the end of his podcast, and it basically does show, because he said like roughly around half the people, like he'd be willing to bet half the people who subscribed and follow his channel used to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think this does propose a very big question to Konami, and it's something that Konami that they really need to take into account. Why do so many people attrition from Yu-Gi-Oh? And it's something that they really do need to take into account if they want to ensure that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is going to prosper in the future. And this is by no means me saying that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is going to die. I am not saying that. I'm not saying because of this Yu-Gi-Oh! Is dying, but it is a problem that needs to be addressed. And I would be very interested to see how Konami does address this situation, if they do. But that's pretty much been my take for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can do so at my Patreon. I normally link it down below, and it's just right there if you guys want to subscribe to it and just want to support if you really like my content in general. But with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support. I appreciate anything you guys support me in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, goodbye, take care.